Okay, and today's topic is understanding the carbon balance of managed boreal forests in northern Sweden using a different set of measurement approaches that come from the bottom up and from the top down, as I will describe in more detail later. And all of these measurements, they are connected to the ICOS Svartberget station, the ICOS infrastructure that either supported or in a way enabled this research within this landscape. And you can see a picture here of the tall tower, the Svartberget tall tower, and you see the Boreal landscape around it. It's a mature forest just around the tower, but if you look a bit further into the back, you can see the variability starting with having younger forest, lakes, and peatland. So it's a typical managed Boreal forest landscape as we go further away from the tower. And in brief, the background for our research here to understand the carbon balance is, of course, that boreal forests are widely understood as important global carbon sinks, and therefore they are also considered as important elements in climate mitigation strategies. But there are still quite some large uncertainties related to understanding the actual carbon sink strengths of managed boreal forest landscape. And also connected to that, trying to develop management strategies and how to manage these boreal forests in a way that we can optimize their climate mitigation potential. And these uncertainties, they are due to several different reasons, of course, but today I want to focus specifically on two key challenges when it comes to estimating the carbon balance of a heterogeneous boreal forest landscape. As you can see here in this illustration, that contains all kinds of different forest stands, young, old forests, clear-cut areas, but also intertwined, we find aquatic systems, peatland systems, and so on. So understanding how this landscape acts as a whole has two key challenges. And first of all, of course, the fluxes vary throughout this landscape strongly in space and time. We have many different sinks with different sink strengths. We have other areas where we have losses of carbon. And connected to that is then the second challenge that our standard measurement techniques for quantifying these carbon fluxes, they are each limited to a distinct scale within this space and time continuum. So we can measure a few units in this landscape very well over a certain time period, but we will not be able to capture this entire variability across space and time in this landscape. So in the end, understanding how this entire forest landscape acts as a carbon sink or source, that is very difficult to quantify. The only way to do it is to use models that are trained by the snapshot measurements to then simulate the carbon sources and sinks across the rest of the landscape. If we look at some key measurement approaches that we have to quantify the carbon balance at different spatial scales, then we can, at the plot level, so here we are talking about a forest inventory plot of a few hundred square meters. Here we can estimate the net carbon balance by measuring the difference of the planned carbon uptake via repeated inventory measurements and the carbon loss from the soil, which we can estimate with chambers connected to portable greenhouse gas analyzers. And this method is quite simple to carry out. Anyone can basically do it, and it's also quite easy to do this at many different places. So it's a good method to cover a spatial gradient. And also because we need to measure all different carbon cycle components to arrive at the net carbon balance, then this measurement approach also gives us quite some detailed information on the different carbon cycle components. The downside of this approach is that it only has usually an annual scale temporal resolution on the carbon balance. And also because we need to measure all these different components, some of them are quite difficult to measure, for example, the below ground carbon allocation. So these individual measurements, they are uncertain in themselves, and so there's quite a risk of large error propagation when it comes to finally estimating the net carbon balance. Alternatively, we can estimate the whole ecosystem carbon balance directly using the eddy-covariance technique, which we do across the ICOS ecosystem stations. And here, the sensors mounted above the forest, they provide us a direct estimate of the net carbon exchange at continuous and high temporal resolution timescales all year round. And this high resolution data is also very valuable in then understanding how short-term variations in environmental drivers regulate these carbon fluxes. But the downside here is that this measurement technique is quite resource demanding. So we can only do this at selected ecosystems within the landscape, but we cannot do this across the space very well. If you move to the landscape scale, then here becomes increasingly challenging to measure the carbon balance of such a heterogeneous landscape. One can use eddy-covariance sensors and mount them to tall towers, because when we measure at greater heights, then the footprint expands, so we can reach a radius of a few kilometers around the tower that provides an integrated estimate of all the carbon fluxes that are going in and out from this landscape. But also this method is, of course, resource demanding. We need a tall tower as a start. And also, while we get a net carbon balance estimate for this landscape scale area, it's quite challenging to understand how the different landscape units actually contribute to this net carbon balance estimate. Alternatively, we can also use our plot level information and make a so-called bottom-up scaling of this information through the landscape. Here we get some more detailed information of the flux variation in the landscape, but essentially we also kind of transfer the error from the plot scale measurement across this landscape. At the regional scale, so with region, I mean here, for example, northern Sweden, as shown in the green area here. Here we can estimate the carbon balance from using atmospheric concentration observations connected with atmospheric transport models and vegetation models that provide information on sinks and sources to do this kind of inverse modeling estimate that gives us then a regional scale carbon balance, primarily based on concentration measurements in the atmosphere. But this method also relies of course, then on models, the atmospheric transport models, the vegetation models, and also it doesn't give really a detailed information on how different units in the landscape contribute to this net carbon balance estimate. And in Sweden, we also have a very detailed national forest inventory program for over 100 years now, where we have detailed tree measurements and soil measurements across the country. And we can also use this information for a bottom-up scaling approach. So you can see that these different methods, they each have some advantages and disadvantages at the different temporal and spatial scales. Most of all, they fundamentally differ in the principle that they use to estimate the carbon balance. Some of them operate by quantifying carbon stock changes. Others estimate the turbulent exchange of air between land and the atmosphere. Others are based on concentration measurements in the atmosphere, and some of them rely heavily also on modeling components. So the question is then, how do these different measurements at the different scales, how do they compare? Should they compare well, since they're measuring essentially different quantities? But of course, we want them to match. And this kind of cross-scale understanding is what we are trying to develop in our work at Svartberget. And one more consideration is that beyond the spatial scale, we also, of course, have this temporal dynamic that a given forest stand, the carbon balance changes over stand age dramatically, especially in the first decades. So, of course, depending at which stage we come into a forest to start measuring, then this will largely affect also our carbon balance estimate. And even at a given stand age, we can have large variations due to differences in stand properties. And so if we map this temporal spatial variation over a managed forest landscape, as you can see here, then we end up with this very fine-scale mosaic of carbon sources and sinks across the landscape that, of course, also temporarily constantly change as forests regrow and get harvested. So understanding the net carbon balance of such a mosaic in the end is quite a research challenge. And we have addressed this question at ICOS Svartberget by establishing a spatially nested measurement program that is centered or that is built around the ICOS Svartberget Tower. And that station is located in northern Sweden. You can see on the left side figure the green marker indicating the position. And it is actually located within the Kricklen watershed, which is a 70 square kilometer watershed. This has been intensively monitored for hydrology over more than 4 decades. It also hosts the SLU Forest Field Station, which with the experimental forests, which has delivered detailed information on forest growth also over 100 years by now. And in fact, you can hopefully see this grid of small black dots throughout the catchment. That is a grid of inventory plots, more than 450, that are continuously measured every 5 years to understand changes in vegetation in this watershed. And out of these, we have selected 50. They are shown these colorful markers. And these forests, they range from 5 to 200 years. And we have used them for detailed plot level studies to understand how the carbon cycle changes across these different boreal forests. And close to the center of this catchment is then the ICOS Svartberget station. And it is actually a combined ecosystem atmosphere station. And that is a feature of the Swedish atmosphere stations, that here we always have added also an ecosystem station. So we measure eddy-covariance on the tall atmosphere station to also operate this place as an ecosystem station. And here the ecosystem is a mature mixed spruce pine forest that we measure around this tower. And nearby we also have another eddy-covariance flux station, the Rosenedal station, which is a 100-year-old pine monoculture forest. So with these measurements, we get some information on the ecosystem scale dynamics of mature boreal forests. Some years ago, we have then also utilized this atmosphere ICOS station and mounted another eddy-covariance system at 60 meters height. And by conducting this tall tower eddy-covariance measurements, we're measuring over several kilometer radius around the tower and capture the net carbon exchange at the landscape level. And finally, we have used the atmospheric observations at the top. So this tall tower is 150 meters tall, and we used this information to do some inverse modeling exercise to estimate the regional scale carbon balance for northern Sweden. And we've also utilized the Swedish NFI, the National Forest Inventory data, to do a bottom-up scaling approach for this northern Swedish area. And while we have done this works at these different scales over the past years, we recently started to ask ourselves, so how well do our different works actually compare? Do we come to the same conclusions? Do we find any differences? And so we started to combine all our data and started this cross-scale comparison, or this cross-method comparison also. And to be able to compare these different measurements across these different scales, the first important thing is, of course, to understand if we are measuring, if the population is similar. How do we measure the same? Are the ages of the trees the same? The properties are about the same? Because, of course, you go from the plot and the landscape to the regional scale, so there can be quite some differences already due to this scale change. Here we can see the mean stand age from our 50 plots, the two Boreal mature forest ecosystems, the landscape and the region. You can see that the mean age of the plot, the landscape and the regional scale, they are quite comparable, around averaging to 76 years. Of course, the mature forests are a bit older, therefore also excluded in most of the comparison, as I will show later on. And if you look at the stand age distribution, then for the landscape and the regional scale shown in the red and the purple bars, we can find quite a similar distribution between our Krückland landscape and the northern region landscape. But if you look at the plot level shown, our 50 stands shown in these yellow bars, then we need to recognize that the younger stands have been a bit underrepresented, and the middle-aged stands from 60 to 80 years were a bit overrepresented, which one needs to take into account when interpreting the comparison of the carbon balances. So if we then look at the carbon balance, here it will be defined as the net ecosystem production, NEP. So here positive annual NEP values indicate that the site was an annual sink for carbon. Negative values indicate a net carbon loss. To the left, you can see the results from the plot level measurements across these 50 different forest stands over 3 years. You can see the large spread of annual NEP across these different stands. You can also nicely see that in 2018, when we had this severe summer drought, then the NEP was reduced at all these stands. And if we average them out, then the mean NEP over 3 years is 129 grams of carbon. And one thing that I would like to clarify here is that we only measured stands between 5 and 200 years old, so we missed stands that are just recently harvested. But from other measurements, we know that in the first year after a clear cut, or the first 2 years, we have emission source functions of about up to -5 or 600 grams. So if we take this into account, then the actual full span of variability across the forest managed landscape is around 1,000 grams of carbon per square meter per year. So that's a huge variability. But moving then on to the landscape level estimates, here we have two estimates, one from the tall tower eddy-covariance measurements and one from the bottom-up scaling of the plot level information. You can see that over the 3 years, they average out to 119 grams of carbon, which is quite similar to the plot level mean. The interesting observation here is that the interannual patterns don't match well between these two approaches, because the tall tower eddy-covariance estimate suggests that 2017 was the year with the lowest carbon uptake, whereas the plot level bottom-up scaling approach suggests that 2018 was the year with the lowest carbon uptake. And I will come back to a possible explanation and discussion of these differences between these two methods shortly. At the regional scale, we have our atmospheric approach using the atmospheric concentration measurement with transport modeling. And we have the NFI-based, plot-based bottom-up approach. And here we also find that they converge to a similar mean carbon uptake compared to the landscape and plot scale. Here at the regional scale, even the interannual patterns match. So both methods suggest 2018 to be the year with the lowest carbon uptake. And overall, we can see that we converge across these three scales to a carbon sink of 118 grams of carbon, which was nice to see that our different measurements over like a multi-year time frame converge to similar sink strengths. Just to also look at the ecosystem estimates, here we have this snapshot estimates of mature forests, which of course have a bit of a different carbon balance. They have a higher NEP, but if we compare them to the mature stands in our plot level data set, then also here we find a reasonable agreement among these different mature forests measured either by EC or by the plot level approach. So after we find this convergence in the net carbon balance, we were wondering, okay, maybe this was just a coincidence. Maybe the methods similarly over or underestimate the component fluxes across bioproduction, uptake, and emissions via ecosystem respiration. So let's look at those component fluxes. And when we compared these component fluxes, then you can see here on the left side the comparison of GPP across primary production across the different scales. We found that it converged also quite well to about 900 grams per square meter per year across the plot, landscape, and region scale. Again, the ecosystem scale is always excluded here because it's just such a snapshot of the landscape. And also the ecosystem aspiration on the right-hand side shows a really nice agreement across these different scales and measurement methods. In the next step, we were then wondering, okay, we have these 3 years. One of them was a drought year. How did this drought year specifically, how did the response of NEP in this drought year, how does this compare among these different scales and measurement techniques? And therefore, we plotted here the reduction or the difference in NEP in 2018 relative to 2016, which was a environmentally a normal year. And so here you can see the negative difference means that there was a reduction in NEP, and we can see this across all measurement approaches, across all scales. But what is interesting is that if one looks closer, then it's always the plot level based estimates that actually show a stronger reduction of the NEP compared to eddy-covariance or atmospheric concentration measurements and so on. And of course, there's some connection between these estimates because we use some information from the plot, from our 50 plots from the quicklime catchment to estimate some relationships also across the other scales. But most of all, the tree biomass change, which is the largest carbon cycle component, that has been measured independently at these different scales. And yet we find a similar reduction. And one explanation in my theory is that the reason is that we are using allometric equations that depend on the stem diameter changes, and they are fixed. They don't take into account if we have environmental variations across the years. So in a drought year, if there is a change in the allocation pattern, so that the trees allocate more carbon below ground and less to above ground, that will of course result in a very small increment in the above ground stem diameter, and therefore the allometric equation will estimate a very much reduced tree growth for the entire tree, not understanding that maybe there was still more allocated below ground. So that could possibly result in a reduced carbon sink estimate for this method. Another exercise that we then carried out was to understand how the NEP responded to the drought across different stand ages. And here we plotted the plot-based NEP estimate. As you can see in the left panel, we plotted the NEP over the stand age. And again, it's the difference in NEP during 2018 compared to the normal year, 2016. And we can see that in the younger forest, we saw the greatest reduction in NEP. And if we then look at the components, here it's the net primary production versus the heterotrophic respiration. And then we can see that the pattern was driven by the response of NPP rather than the respiration loss. And the first interpretation of this result could be that, sure, the younger trees have smaller root systems, so they were not able to access the water so well in this dry summer, so that's why they suffered the most and reduced the growth. But with our detailed plot level data, we were actually able to separate the response of the tree canopy and the forest floor vegetation. We call this here understory, but it's really the vegetation on the forest floor that we mean here. And we could show that The tree growth was actually hardly affected during the drought here. But if you, on the right-hand side, the bottom, look at the understory forest floor vegetation, then there we saw a considerable reduction during the drought, first of all. And then the other important observation is that in these young forests, the understory NPP actually contributes 50 or even more percent to the total NPP, whereas the tree NPP is less important. So that's why this ecosystem response in NEP that we see in the top left panel was primarily driven by the dominance of the forest floor vegetation productivity at the stand age and their increased sensitivity to drought. In a more recent work, we have now extended, or we have tried to improve this bottom-up estimate at the landscape, because so far we only consider the forested land, which is about 90% of the catchment. But we also have about 10% contribution from lakes and meres. And we included an estimate for their carbon balances as well and added this to the landscape. So now we have this pixel of 12 by 12 meters, suggesting a carbon balance across the landscape. And if you simply average out all these pixels, then the carbon balance is a bit lower now. So it's 92 grams of carbon. And if you compare this with our tall tower eddy-covariance estimate of 137 grams over the same 3 years, then it's within the same bulk part, I would say, but about a 1/3 lower. So then we were thinking, okay, we also have to understand that our tall tower eddy-covariance measurement footprint does not actually cover the entire catchment, and also the contribution from nearby the tower is more than those areas further away from the tower. So then we use this footprint information and we started to add weights to the individual pixels in the bottom up approach. So we scaled the contribution of each pixel according to the footprint information. And the result of this bottom up scaling suggested a carbon balance of 97 grams. A bit closer to the tall tower estimate, but really only a marginal improvement from the simple estimates. And we were a bit disappointed about this result, but then also realized that the footprint of the eddy-covariance measurements are mainly within an area where we have mature and middle-aged forests, and the carbon balance across those landscape units doesn't vary so much as you would have really clear cuts and meres and lakes in the core, in the main footprint. So therefore, maybe this advanced approach did not really improve our estimate, as opposed to if you would have a very heterogeneous landscape around the tower directly. The final slide, or the final work that I would like to present is our work in estimating the so-called net landscape carbon balance. This is based on the NECB concept, the net ecosystem carbon balance concept developed by Chapin et al. 2006. So here we estimate the net landscape carbon balance by summing up all the vertical exchanges of CO2 and methane. And we account for the losses of carbon via aquatic export in the streams network, and the carbon lost via tree harvest. And from our tall tower eddy-covariance measurements of CO2 and methane over multiple years, we know that we have about 1.5 tons of carbon. Now I'm switching to the units of tons carbon per hectare per year. So we have an uptake. And if we consider the loss of aquatic carbon and carbon via the harvest export, then we find that this managed boreal forest landscape in the end provides a net sink of 1.2 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And we can also see that our 5-year records from 2016 to 2020 show that the landscape was a sink in every single of these 5 years, despite large environmental variations from one year to the next. In 2017, that was the year with the lowest uptake. That is actually related to a relatively wet and cool and cloudy summer, which probably reduced the light during the summer, thereby reducing the forest growth. You also see that the terrestrial carbon flux dominates the NLCP, whereas the aquatic and harvest carbon losses are small but still significant enough to make an impact on the net carbon balance. And with that, I would like to come to an end and just end with a few key messages to take away. So based on developing the spatially nested measurement framework around the ICOS Svartberget station, we were able to show that the estimate of the carbon balance and its component fluxes can actually converge across different scales and across different measurement techniques if we consider multi-year averages. But we also found that the interannual patterns between different methods can be different. There can be a divergence in those measurements, especially also when it comes to the response of NEP to drought. We saw some interesting scale or approach dependency on those results. And overall, these results then confirm and consolidate the carbon sink strength of these managed boreal forests in northern Sweden. But they also highlight the need to further understand why different methods or different scales give us different information in the response to drought, for example, or environmental conditions. And finally, I would like to end with a suggestion that such multi-scale measurement programs can also be implemented at other ICOS stations where we already have the infrastructure in place to add on additional measurements to understand the carbon flows and uptake and emission rates at different temporal and spatial scales. For example, at the atmosphere towers, one could add instrumentation to also conduct eddy-covariance measurements at the tall tower to get the landscape scale footprint, or establishing detailed grids of ground-based measurements to further understand the component of the ecosystem, the trees versus the forest floor versus the soil, and how they all contribute to the net exchange that we measure with our eddy-covariance systems above the ground. And with that, I'm finished, and I would just like to end by thanking all my great collaborators and colleagues who have made all this work possible, and of course, ICOS and the other funding agencies that have supported this research. And I'm happy to take some questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Matthias. That was a very illuminating and comprehensive talk on the multi-scale approach of carbon balance estimation. Indeed, we are very excited to hear about all of these things. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but while I think maybe people are still thinking about it, I was maybe start, and I was intrigued by the aquatic carbon export that you had mentioned. How can you explain maybe briefly how you do the measurements for the aquatic carbon export in your last work?
Yes, sure. The aquatic carbon export, that is actually operated as part of another research group within the Kriegland catchment. So it's not part of the ICOS measurements, but we connect these results. And the way that this export is quantified is that they have weirs installed at the outlet of the catchment, and that measures the flow rate of water that leaves the landscape. And then they do frequent sampling, take water samples and analyze it for the DOC, the organic and inorganic carbon in the soils in the water. They do this weekly to bi-weekly throughout the entire year, and by multiplying the carbon concentration in the water with the water flow rate, they can then estimate how much carbon is leaving the ecosystem, the landscape.
Okay, so these measurements are not done within ICOS, are they?
No, they are done by the Kriegland water research team.
Right. Yes, thank you. We have a question from Ladislav. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Very nice work and very nice presentation. It's really interesting to see this integration across the scales. I was just wondering about the uncertainty estimations when you were showing the plots of NEP estimates across the scales, especially for the larger scale approaches. Uh, did you use multiple footprint models or multiple carbon cycle models or things like this when all these individual larger scale estimates were produced? I think mostly if you have told our eddy-covariance, maybe not at that scale yet, but at the higher scales than this one.
You mean at the regional scale or?
Original, yeah.
Uh, yeah, that's of course a very good question to understand the uncertainty around these estimates. Uh, because, yeah, especially at the lower scale, we do the component measurements, then at each measurement we introduce some uncertainty, and we try to propagate this uncertainty with the propagation uh, rules to the final carbon balance estimate. But then what I have shown in these figures, the error around it, that is also due to interannual variation that has been averaged over 3 years. And at the landscape scale, this total eddy coherence measurements, the uncertainty here is basically based on Monte Carlo exercises, resampling, just as we do for the conventional eddy coherence method. And when it comes to the regional scale, then I have to admit that this is beyond my own core expertise. So that is actually my collaborators that have done this inversion modeling work. But I know that they, of course, also do some sensitivity analysis for the atmospheric transport model specifically, but also for the vegetation models that are used to produce these prior estimates of sinks and sources in the landscape.
Thank you very much. We had just this exchange with some scientists looking at the large scale, showing that if multiple footprint models and those ecosystem models are utilized, sometimes the uncertainty bar is really huge. So I was wondering, what's your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with the footprint now, if you refer to eddy coherence measurements, uh, yes, we know if we use one footprint model instead of another model, we can get already different footprint estimates. Um, but I mean, the different footprint estimates necessarily don't affect the net carbon balance. It's just that we don't know exactly from which area now this net carbon balance is estimated for. Uh, And for the regional scale estimates, I mean, one key uncertainty is also here how many, I mean, this work is of course not based on only the Svartberget atmospheric measurements, but from the network of atmospheric towers across the Nordic domain. So including the other Swedish atmospheric stations, some from Finland and Norway. So the coverage of these atmospheric towers also determine how certain this estimate can be done for a specific regional area within Europe, for example.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias.
Mhm.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. So if there are no more questions and I don't see any hands.
Can we ask?
Jürgen
Yes.
has a hand up, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. It seems like a work of many years combined. uh, and I think it's very interesting to see those large variations in the plot scale measurements and have a look at the drivers behind that. And apparently, there's some plots that are already carbon source, I see. And is it related to the water conditions in those plots?
You mean at the plot level?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I mean, the key driver of this variability is actually the difference in stand age, because this 50 plot level estimates, they were done in different forest stands that range from 5 to 200 years old. So that's why for these younger stands, they are acted as a source, and the more mature forests start to become a sink. So that's why we have this very large spread in these plot level estimates.
Okay, thanks.
And it's not so much related to the hydrology as you were asking for. It's
Yeah.
really driven by the changes in tree productivity across this age gradient that we were covering in this 50 stands.
Okay.
Do we see any more hands? Sorry, I'm navigating on my... Yes, no more hands. So if there are no more questions to Matthias, thank you again, once again, from all of us for this very illuminating talk. And thank you to all of the audience, for the participants. And we will invite you to the next ICOS talk, which will be in a month's time.